Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this UK GBC COP26 seminar. How do smart and flexible buildings help us reach net zero? In a second, I will introduce all of our panelists. But before that, I'd like to remind you that there's an Ask the Question opportunity as you've signed in. So please do start thinking about the questions you'd like us to pick up. Because this is only an hour, we'll cover as many as we can in the half an hour after our panelists have spoken, but then we will gather them all up afterwards and respond to you, probably collectively, by aggregating the questions and perhaps writing a blog on the Active Building Centre website, and we'll share that after the event. So in the order that they'll be speaking, first I'd like to introduce Joanna Clark, who works at the Specific Research Programme at the University of Swansea. Joanna, perhaps you'll wave so everybody can see you. Dr. Kate Carter from the School of Architecture at the University of Edinburgh is with us, unfortunately without video at the moment, but she'll speak after Joanna. Then Charlotte Ramsey, who works at Ofgem on the Full Chain Flexibility Policy Programme. And then finally, Emily Bourne, who's the Director of Energy Systems and Networks at BEIS. So those will be our panelists and speakers. But before we get to them, I will virtually introduce Caroline Chappell, who is our graphic recording artist. And you'll see in a second a creation that she's going to develop for us as we go through the panel discussion. We'll then come back to the panel and the Q&A. And at some point after this event, we'll share the final creation that Caroline has magicked into being for us. So over to you, Joanna.
Thank you, Hywel, and good afternoon, everyone. As Hywel said, I'm an architect and design manager at Specific Innovation and Knowledge Centre at Swansea University, where we have developed a concept that we call active buildings as one of the solutions to decarbonising the built environment. We're all aware of the need to reduce the energy consumption and carbon emission from buildings. But as the UK progresses towards a decarbonised society, the need for energy flexibility between buildings and energy networks is also critical. So we define active buildings as buildings that integrate renewable energy technologies for heat, power and transport, supporting the wider grid network by combining energy generation with energy storage and smart controls. By maximising locally generated energy and controlling when that energy is exported to the grid, as well as when energy is imported from the grid, we're able to achieve an energy balance between buildings and the wider energy network. And this eases the strains put on the energy system by the increasing electricity demand for heating our buildings and for powering our vehicles, and also the strains imposed by the otherwise uncontrolled renewable energy that is fed into the grid. So in order to prove this concept, we've constructed 2 demonstrator buildings on Swansea University's campus, and these allow us to showcase and test novel low-carbon technologies, trial different control strategies, and build an evidence base from which further active buildings can be developed. There are many challenges to adopting any new concept, particularly in the construction industry, due to the many risks involved with new ways of doing things and using new technologies. Sometimes a lack of knowledge and training on new concepts, the capital costs of building projects, programme constraints, and also the types of procurement routes that are used on building projects. These are just some of the challenges we've encountered in our own buildings. So to share the learnings from our building demonstrators, we've developed an active building toolkit, and this is aimed at providing evidence of how the concept works, which is backed up by data from our buildings, and is aimed at enabling the design and development of lots of active buildings across the UK. It also supports the progress of the other enablers to the concept of smart, flexible buildings that are necessary, such as, for example, the development of new business models, training programs, standards, and legislation, all of which are critical if we are to change the way we think about buildings and to meet our decarbonisation challenge. So I'm just going to hand over to Kate now.
Thanks, Charlotte. So I, as Hywel introduced me, I'm an academic in the School of Architecture, and I've been asked to give a few points relative to buildings and how they fit within the idea of smart and flexible. So fundamentally, point number one, which I believe is the absolute most important one, is we need to improve all our building fabric first before we think about the energy systems that are going to serve our buildings, especially with the transition from gas to electricity. So reducing energy demand by 80% is feasible if we do the upgrade to buildings. The biggest demand is for heating. And so essentially, to support the transition to a smart and flexible energy system, we really need to think about radical energy efficiency in our buildings. This then opens up the potential of smart, flexible buildings to be much more responsive, to essentially fine-tune energy use and use a renewables-based smart grid, which actually doesn't need as much capacity if we deal with our buildings first. So that's the main overarching point that I want to make. But when we talk about smart buildings, I think we need to understand that they're not the same as fully automated buildings, and smart buildings and the people within them have got to be thought of as an ecosystem, how the building actually is used and how it performs. So we need to think carefully about technology, sensors, actuators, and make sure that they're not imposed in a way that alienates people and perhaps prevents them from engaging in the idea of a smart and flexible building. So sensors that link lighting to occupation or heating to temperatures need to be much more sophisticated if they are to work well with shifting and changing conditions to do with how people use buildings or what environments they desire or need to be able to operate safely, and also thinking about other uses of buildings. So buildings will be designed for one use and they may in the future be used for something different. Another couple of points which I think add to the complexity of what we're talking about and what the idea of comfort and well-being, which don't always sit alongside the idea of smart buildings, I think has got to be made central to what we're trying to achieve, so that things like fuel poverty are a thing of the past. Households and businesses need to be the main beneficiaries of a smart building and a wider grid transition. And so the idea of comfort is something that needs to be embedded into smart buildings so that they deliver clean air, healthy thermal and lighting environments for the people that use the buildings. And then lastly, flexibility is something that we need to consider when we're talking about smart buildings, and obviously today is about smart and flexible buildings. And I think with that comes the idea of adaptability and the ability of buildings to both adapt to the conditions of the people using the buildings, but also the external conditions. So I think we all acknowledge whatever happens with the outcome of COP, climate change is happening, and buildings are going to have to adapt to changing conditions, more extreme highs and lows in temperatures, and rain events and weather events that our buildings are going to have to adapt to. And I think that is fundamentally what a flexible and smart building needs to be able to do, one that can change and adapt and reflect to the needs of the people that are going to use the buildings. So I'm going to hand over now to Charlotte.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. So I'm going to take this up a level now to the system level and talk through Ofgem's work on full chain flexibility and how this starts to knit together all of those active buildings and active participants in a broader contribution to how we create a more flexible system that Kate was alluding to. So the challenge that we're looking at is significant here. The UK has around 30 million buildings and one of the oldest building stocks in Europe, and 17% of our national emissions are coming from buildings. So to hit net zero by 2050, around 2/3 of electricity generation is going to be coming from weather-dependent wind and solar power. So reducing emissions from our buildings and adapting the energy system so that it's able to get the most from this high penetration of renewables is going to be presenting two really big challenges. And what we're seeing is that these challenges can be addressed by this solution of flexibility or full chain flexibility. So full chain flexibility, what does this mean? And what does this mean in the context of buildings? Our vision is for a secure and affordable net zero system where all connected resources can contribute to their full and efficient potential to meeting system needs. And that all connected resources absolutely must include the buildings and the end users within those buildings who need to play a significant part in providing the flexibility, these flexibility benefits to the system. It's sort of where the phrase full chain flexibility has been coined from, because I think historically, we've really just seen the traditional market actors, the sort of generation actors, as being the ones who are able to make a difference in terms of providing flexibility. But to really unlock the benefits that we see as being there, it has to be the full chain that we see, the full energy chain, including buildings and consumers that contribute. And the value that we're looking at unlocking here is a massive reduction in the future system costs. So an estimated saving of around 16 to 17 billion pounds a year from 2050 if we can move to this more flexible system. We're not saying that it's going to be cheaper than today, but we do know that the costs of getting to net zero are going to be significant. And the most important thing to ensure that we get there will be making sure that we can do that at least cost. And we really see that flexibility is the way to achieve that. And buildings and end users play such an important role there. Now, even in the short term, so let's say over the next 10 years or even less, we're going to see some huge changes, and the system will be facing some challenges in the short to medium term that we're going to need to overcome. So, for example, coming from the sort of buildings and end user space, much higher demand for electricity through electric vehicle uptake and the decarbonisation of heat in our homes. And these short-term challenges are going to be putting upward pressure on system costs. It's going to be making it harder and harder to be running the system in a cost-effective way. But we've also got this massive input of renewable generation, low-carbon generation coming through. But this also offers new opportunities, as we've heard about from Joanna and from Kate. Active buildings, active consumers also offer new opportunities to start delivering against this flexibility vision. So more electric vehicles, for example. Whilst it means more demand for electricity, on the flip of this, it means we have a vast new source of battery storage that we could take advantage of, the system operators could take advantage of, to help balance and operate the system more cost effectively. Same for technologies like heat pumps or other components of an active home. So what we need to do now, what the regulator needs to do now with support of government and of the sector, is to put those building blocks in place that create the new markets and the new frameworks that will deliver a fully flexible energy system to realise these benefits. Now, in Ofgem, we've identified 3 areas that we think we need to be working on to make progress towards full chain flexibility. Our first priority is in system planning and operation. What needs to change in the way that we operate and plan the system? The second priority, developing the right signals to incentivise that flexible behaviour and investment. So how do we clearly signal opportunities and reward the behaviour of those that are able to provide flexibility? So that's opportunities for investment in the longer term and rewarding the behaviour of those who can provide flexibility in the shorter term. But the third and probably the most important priority from a buildings and end users perspective is looking at consumer behaviour. So what are the consumer needs that facilitate that delivery of flexibility, and how do we increase the response to system constraints and increase the involvement from all consumers, large and small, industrial, commercial, domestic, non-domestic? How do we ensure that all consumers are able to benefit from this, not just those with the technical know-how? And how do we protect those that are not able to participate? And on that third point, Consumers are already playing a really significant role in the energy system, and we need to consider really carefully how to meet their needs in a system that requires more flexibility, but also how to empower them to participate. So there's some really big questions here about how consumers will want to engage. And there's also a really big role for innovators and for business in this space to come up with creative solutions that meet the needs of different consumers, that empower different consumers, that ensure the vulnerable are protected. And we want to be able to use unique buildings which have unique challenges such that they can also all participate in finding this value that flexibility offers for us. So we're seeing some really big challenges coming, reducing emissions from our buildings and adapting the energy system so it gets the most from this high penetration of renewables. It's a really big challenge, and one that we believe can be pretty significantly addressed by bringing full chain flexibility to the fore. Full chain flexibility gives this opportunity for all connected resources, buildings absolutely included, to contribute to their full efficient potential to helping the system meet its needs, helping to operate this net zero system. Consumers in the buildings they inhabit do already play a really significant role in the energy system. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges for regulators and for policymakers in the sector to make sure that we're enabling consumer involvement in this fully flexible energy system. And I'll pass over now to Emily, who can give you that even broader picture again as to how government is weighing in.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm Emily Bourne, Director for Energy Systems and Networks at BEIS. So as has been set out by the other speakers, to reach our ambitious net zero goals, we need huge changes across the energy system, and buildings are a core part of this. Homes, offices and public buildings account for around 30% of our country's CO2 emissions, most of which is heating. To reduce this and reach net zero, all buildings will need to transition to clean heat. Alongside the electrification of transport, this is anticipated to lead to a doubling of electricity use by 2050. This presents huge challenges for us all. To deliver this transition in a way that also delivers value to consumers, we need to take a system-wide approach, as Charlotte has just been setting out. No longer can we depend on piling more coal onto the fire to turn up the system to meet demands. We need to match the intermittency of renewables with the demand of consumers. We need to be smarter. When we have 40 gigawatts of wind on the system in 2030, we'll need around 30 gigawatts of low carbon flexible assets to balance the grid. This flexibility provides significant cost savings in a decarbonised electricity system. We need the whole energy system to work smarter and be much more flexible. Buildings, the appliances we use and how we use them are central to this. In the smart and flexible system, buildings will shift from being passive dispensers of energy to active nodes in the energy system, reacting to signals to optimise the system. Through smart appliances and smart controls, reacting to price signals, buildings will provide flexibility to the system, reduce costs and give consumers control. Our strategy to get there has been set out in our recent interlinked policy publications. This summer, we published with Ofgem our Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan. This includes measures to facilitate flexibility from consumers, remove barriers to flexibility on the grid, reform markets to reward flexibility, and digitalise our energy system. The plan includes a commitment to continue to work with industry to incorporate flexibility and smart technologies in the standard assessment procedure, and for non-domestic premises in the simplified building energy model. The government will also work with stakeholders and international partners to consider the merits of introducing a separate smart readiness indicator for assessing how optimised a building is for smart technologies. Smart technologies, including energy storage and flexible heating systems, will play an important role in new buildings, and this will be investigated as part of the development work of the Future Homes and Future Building Standards. We'll ensure that flexibility is considered across a full range of energy efficiency, fuel poverty and heat subsidy schemes and market mechanisms across government. We'll also consider how smart technologies should be treated under our policy framework for energy-related products, which we'll publish and engage with stakeholders on later this year. Last month, we published the UK Net Zero Strategy and Heat and Building Strategy. Smart systems and flexibility are discussed throughout both documents and form an important part of our plan to deliver net zero. Key policies include an ambition that by 2035, no new gas boilers will be sold, a new £450 million 3-year boiler upgrade scheme, which will see households offered grants of up to £5,000 for low carbon heating, and a new £60 million heat pump ready programme that will provide funding for pioneering heat pump technologies and will support the government's target of 600,000 installations a year by 2028. Thank you, and I'm going to hand now back to Hywel.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, all the speakers. I'm going to leave the image up for a second. Obviously, it will get refined and improved, not just with what we're about to talk about, but there's always something in the rich picture that illustrations can help give us another view of what we think the interactions are and some of the relationships between them. So we will develop this further, both in the short moment of this, the next half an hour. So we'll come back to it just before we finish, and then we will publish it in a week or two once we've had a chance to digest some of the observations that come out of the questions and other things. So I'm now going to go back to the panel and to start to put to them some of the questions that arise from both their contributions and the imagery. And great to see, Kate, your video has come to life just at the perfect moment. So my first question, sort of drawing on some of those observations and contributions, and people can still ask a question if they want us to consider it now or after the event. This whole question, it's pretty clear from what everybody has said that buildings are a sort of the new energy asset, or a new energy asset, because I guess EVs are as well. There's a question about how much of it is buildings and how much of it is EVs and how much of it is EVs connected to buildings. Perhaps I could ask you whether you think it's all buildings could or should become energy assets, or just some, and what you think the considerations in that domain might be. I could pick on somebody, but perhaps, Charlotte, I'll actually ask you, and then we'll go around the group if that's okay. So should it be all buildings, or are there some questions we need to think about in terms of which ones?
I think there's always going to be a challenge trying to be comprehensive about sort of obligations, because certainly all inhabitants of all buildings are not currently empowered to be able to participate, and there's always going to be some who are not going to be able to participate. I think what's going to be important is more that the supporting infrastructure should be it should enable all buildings to participate if they're able to. In terms of the volume of response that we might need to be able to realise the value of flexibility that we see, I think it's the kind of making sure that the really big contributors, so electric vehicles, decarbonised heat solutions, it's most important that those things can participate. As to whether a comprehensive blanket of all buildings should be able to participate, kind of all things should be able to participate, I think it needs further analysis to understand whether it's really worth it to kind of to drive for a completely comprehensive participation, because there'll start to be other things at play.
If I could, Hywel, just to add to that, I mean, I think Charlotte is right, and what we're very keen to do from the government point of view is not to kind of mandate and try to be very inflexible about what we want to see, but to create the right conditions for the market to come forwards. And you know, we should be conscious that we've got a huge variety of different buildings across the country with different purposes, different occupants, and there needs to be some flexibility for the right solutions to be found for the right buildings. So I think, as Charlotte says, you know, it's not about sort of rigorously mandating, but it's about creating frameworks so that these things can be developed as appropriate for the different building stock.
Okay, I can see both Kate and Joanna nodding to that. Kate, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, I hopefully made a clear point about people through my short presentation. And I think what's really vital is that we make sure that there's parity of access to this smart energy grid system. And I think a lot of costs attached to technology have got to be absorbed by society rather than individuals to ensure that that happens. And this builds on work that I've done over the last few years in social housing, and the balance of unfairness of access to just comfortable, warm homes is basically, you know, a real barrier to sort of well-being across society. So I think the smart sort of evolution of buildings has got to allow parity. Whether it's in all buildings, I think that's questionable because it's got to be appropriate, but it certainly has got to build on a sort of fairness. And I think we're at that juncture, and COP26, if anything, is raising the ante on that, about making sure that we change radically to be more fair. So I think that, to me, is a really important thing that we should not be overlooking.
Thank you. Joanna, did you want to add? I think you might be muted.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah, no, I'd agree with everything. I think it's unrealistic probably to suggest that all buildings will be, because whether they can be or not, I just think it's probably a bit unrealistic to say that they all will. But going back to what Kate just said, we are noticing the social housing associations are actually a lot more forward thinking than the sort of traditional big house builders. And actually people living in social housing who perhaps do struggle more with fuel poverty, they are now sort of, I mean, their buildings are more progressive than most houses. So I think it's being sorted from that side. And I think that will help to increase awareness and to educate people about the buildings. I think the more of these smart buildings we can develop, the better, because it just helps people it helps increase awareness with people. And I think we're seeing that come through with social housing as one sector.
Okay, thank you. I've now got a group of questions that are perhaps in the sort of system sense. So maybe Emily, I'll start with you on this group. But this whole question, you know, you've all talked about the energy system. Clearly, we can have a discussion about where the energy system now, where its boundary now is, if in effect cars and homes and other buildings are part of, they're all active energy assets, or many of them are. So how do you think regulation, practicalities of, you know, incentivization and some of the rewards and encouragements that are in the system, how are they going to play out beyond the immediate sense of the energy system? How are we going to encourage builders to build good things? How are we going to encourage retrofitters to retrofit in a sensible and appropriate way? Perhaps, Emily, you would touch, perhaps if you can, anything more you can say on this readiness indicator, because it sounds like that would be a particular part of this equation of the boundaries shifted. What do we need to do with this new, I'm not going to call it, well, it's a sort of ring of an onion, isn't it? It's coming to the system. How might we reflect on what needs to be done in that domain? Emily.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think these are really important points. And, you know, looking at the net zero strategy that we published, it was either last week or a couple of weeks ago, extremely recently. What is absolutely clear in that is how much reaching net zero is a total cross-economy effort. And how much we need to look across all sectors. And I think, to your point, Hywel, energy is becoming much more integrated with other sectors. And to some extent within government, you know, we have changed the way that we work to reflect that. So, for instance, on electric vehicles, we have a joint unit between Department for Transport and BEIS, which focuses on development of policy on electric vehicle deployment, because, you know, these two things have become far more integrated than they ever have before. I think, you know, what that's meant for us across government is working much more closely with our colleagues across different departments on preparation for net zero. And I think you see that in the work that's been done on the heat and building strategy as well as net zero. Specifically, you asked about the smart readiness indicator. So that's something that we're considering at the moment, as to how you might bring that in and give people basically information when they're looking at house purchases on how ready their property might be for different smart technologies, and whether that would be part of the EPC or alongside the EPC or a bit of both. But that's policy development that's going on at the moment within the department. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anybody else want to add to that one? Okay, if not, I've got another one which sort of builds on that quite nicely. There's something about solutions that are integrated, and whether that's a system integrated sense, which to some respects all of you touched on, or integrated in the building. It's great to hear that you've got that joint team, Emily. Some people in the question and in other work that I've done have raised this slight concern that unless we think about how to optimize that, we could end up with householders getting a smart meter if they haven't already, and then in a little while they'll be encouraged to get a charge point if that's suitable for their home, their semi or their detached, and then a bit later they'll be encouraged to get a heat pump, and then somebody might come and tell them that, oh, you actually need a different cable now because you've only got single phase, it's not got the capability to support those things. And that sense, particularly going back to what I know of Joanna's work, that sort of sequence means it almost certainly will be both unoptimized, under-integrated, so may not even work very well together, and more expensive. So how do we think, that sort of make it work together question gets answered? And there's a slight side issue, two or three people have pointed out, there's a question of the data, where's that held, how does that work? It sort of, clearly there's a data question for the local grid. It feels like there might also be a data question for what we might see as the brain of the house or the building as that emerges. Now, Kate, you're nodding enthusiastically, so I might come to you first on that one, and then perhaps Charlotte.
Yeah, I think this idea of technology is, we all know every year there's new technology coming out, the latest version of something. And I think therein lies the problem where technology can become overly sophisticated. So I did allude to that. We need more sophisticated ways of buildings being smart, but I think that sophistication comes from a balance between technology, which is essentially should be an on-off, something that can be, balanced with what we do. So we're all familiar with the light switch. We turn it on and off, but I think we've all been in early versions of the smart buildings where the lights went off when somebody was still in the room because the sensor was inadequate, and that we laugh about it, but actually there will be a new version which we'll laugh about in years to come of what we put in place for smart buildings. So I think again it comes back to parity. I think we've got to be careful because some sophisticated smart technology is very expensive. So actually I think simplifying things gives us the opportunity to make it available to all, but also keep it as a fairly flexible sort of person-centered thing rather than an automated building that does things when you don't really want it to do those things.
Yes, okay. Charlotte, if I come to you, but Joanna, I'll warm you up I know you've probably got some experience of the active demonstrators at Swansea on how lights and sensors do or don't play in the relative energy demands they make on the system. But Charlotte.
So I'd like to pick up on the thread that you touched on, Hywel, around the kind of roles and responsibilities of other actors outside the household. So answering the question of how do I, as an individual, domestic or non-domestic in a home, I'm being told I've got my smart meter, I've got my charge point, I'm then being encouraged to take more of an active part in my sort of local energy markets. But how do I coordinate and optimize that for myself? In part, it is about the individual wanting to be engaged, or maybe a sort of business stepping in to be able to support a more passive consumer do that and make those decisions. But outside outside the four walls of a home, outside the four walls of any building, there's a number of actors whose roles are changing quite dramatically, and the interaction is changing quite dramatically. So I would pull out the distribution network operator, the retailer, who, the sort of current crisis is changing everything like even more, but the retail supplier, the local authority, there's these three parties have a really important new role to play. And a lot of that has yet to be defined. And what we're seeing is a lot more activity concentrating down to the neighbourhood level, the regional level, and roles and responsibilities to help make that an organised effort, which includes people, includes communities, and sends the right information to the right places, has the right discussions about, sort of forward thinking around planning, practical things. When should we dig up the roads for X, Y, and Z? Because which areas do we know need to be reinforced, and how do we integrate that with other challenges that we're seeing in planning? I think there's work to be done that involves, it stretches beyond, certainly it's beyond where central government is at, and the regulator only has a part to play. There's something that needs to be convened that helps to bring, I guess in particular, the local authorities back into this space, because there's so much interactivity with the things that local planners, local buildings officials kind of have to say in this space, and it needs to be integrated with the existing energy actors and energy organisations that exist at the regional level.
Yes, okay. I think there's quite an important set of issues about planning and organising and doing work, and against what outcome, which I will come back to if that's okay. Joanna, do you want to pick up this sort of line of thread, particularly with your experience of buildings that you've built that are smart and flexible because they're active buildings?
I mean, I think the key thing, one of the things you just said earlier was about the data, because it's all very well collecting the data, but someone's got to manage all of that. So in our buildings, we do collect a lot of data. And one of the problems, I think, is people is getting access to data from some of the systems. And as you said about the conflict between different getting access to smart meters and EV charging and getting them to talk to each other. So I don't know if there's a way of sort of regulating more to make these things more compatible, because I know people who are afraid to put a smart meter in because then if they change supplier, it won't work, and they just don't want the upheaval. And you can understand that. And I think these sorts of things do put people off. They do put consumers off from moving forward and accepting some of these things, and they put people off technology. So I think there needs to be some kind of way of regulating the people who are manufacturing these equipment. Is there some way of making sure that they are all compatible? I think it needs everybody to work together if we're really going to make this work. But the question of data, I think, is always going to be a tricky one, because a lot of buildings, even when they have meter input in, nobody's actually monitoring them. You need somebody to look after that data. And it's easier with somebody who, someone who's got a large estate, like maybe a housing association or a university estate, where they can perhaps do that. But for individual buildings, individual companies or homeowners, it's quite a challenge. And I'm not quite sure what the answer is to that.
Yes, okay. I mean, Emily, it may well be that government has plans, both on the data interoperability sort of side of the question, but also that expectation of who holds what data for whom. There've been quite a few questions about this. How do you actually make it work in a way that's meaningful, respects degrees of privacy and whose data it might be, but also allows the system to use the data, because if it's completely encased in some sort of protection, then it's not necessarily useful. Any observations on that you'd like to add?
Yeah, thank you. I think they're really important points. And, our heat and building strategy has quite a bit of an emphasis on getting standards, focusing on standards, because we're really at that stage of deployment a lot of these technologies now, where we go from sort of early adopters to trying to step us up to mass deployment in a similar way to what we're doing with electric vehicles in the transport space. So I think getting those standards right to give consumers confidence. A lot of the things that have been raised today by the panel is exactly what we need to give people confidence on across the piece. So we've got a bit of focus on the standards there. The other kind of area of focus is on innovation. So things like heat pump technology, to get heat pumps so that they are more affordable, attractive to have in your house, that we can give consumers confidence and making something that they would be, comfortable to have in their homes, again on a mass scale rather than an early adopter scale. So it's that kind of focus. And then I think the other side to the data piece is the cybersecurity questions, which we're also putting quite a bit of focus on, because again, you need to be able to give consumers confidence that those kind of protections are in place.
Yes, okay. I've now got a group of questions which in a sense are two sides of a coin, it feels. There's a set of questions or sort of issues around demand and what demand are we trying to meet, and then actually picking up on Charlotte's observations about planning and organising to meet that. You've got to try and get these things to sit together. On the demand question, you often see, and there are various estimates of how much more electricity we'll need, because clearly we will need more as cars move from liquid fuels to electric, as many homes move from gas, natural fossil fuels to electrification. I think one of the things that's really struck me about my work and with Joanna and others in the sort of active environment is that is a gross demand. If you start building buildings such as the ones that Joanna's designed, that gross demand doesn't necessarily appear in the network because the building is managing it. So there's something about how it's de-peaked, how it's got its own capacity to capture some energy, store it in and around its sort of own curtilage, so that the demand down the pipe or the wire, and in the case of, I guess what we're talking about is mostly going to be wires. There isn't like the gross demand might have gone up by 2 or 3 times, but the actual observed demand hasn't, because the building asset and the vehicle asset have done a job on reducing that and managing it. So any thoughts on that? But then there's also the other side of the equation. It feels to me like we are, as we decarbonise buildings, about to deal with the hardest sector. And in a way, it's harder than planes and ships, because planes and ships are only made by so many people. And once you deal with a few actors, you might be challenging to deal with them. But once you've helped create the right framework for incentives and what have you, you've shifted the 10 people who make, or the 10 companies that make planes. We've all got our house and we've all got interest in workplaces and other things. And unlike the new telephone, which is a separate thing, I can still have my landline, this has not affected it. It's just, in a sense, come in next to it. Heating systems and energy systems in buildings and their connectivity to the wider system, whether you need to dig up a road, whether you should be on a heat network or not, rightly play into some form of local planning where we're upgrading the whole of the place with energy in mind. So some of you might be more interested in this demand. How can we manage it to make sure it's not as big an impact? Some of you might be more interested in how do we plan to actually deliver it. So Kate, again, I'm going to come to you because you're the most enthusiastic nodder I can see on my screen. And then I might come to Joanna, Charlotte, and Emily in that order.
Yeah, so I can't lay claim to these facts, but the Passive House Trust have been doing a lot of presentations recently, and so this comes directly from one of their presentations, and essentially it was looking at this very issue. So Passive House, I'm sure many of the panel and attendees are familiar with, is a form of radical energy efficiency measures, and on average, you can achieve 80% reduction in energy use. So one, that's reducing demand, full stop, but also what it's doing. And I think, Passive House is the most complete version of a really energy efficient building, but even less than Passive House still does this. It irons out the peaks. So basically the building remains at a nice temperature. So you don't need to blast it with heat when you come home from work or in the morning when you get up. And so it's doing two things. One, it's reducing energy demand on the whole, but it's doing exactly what the smart grid needs it to do. So it comes back to my initial point of, if we do that, then we essentially make the smart grid a much easier proposition, especially one that is zero carbon, so not relying on, dare I say, nuclear, but we can go to genuine renewables in a much more robust way if we deal with the buildings really, really well. But it takes doing it really well, not just a wee bit of loft insulation or single measures. It's about doing the whole building. and making sure the whole building and the energy system, which is part of the whole building, are really well thought through. And that extends, although I always talk about the building, I'm talking about the cities, the communities, the connected buildings. So whether they're connected through ownership or management or just location, that's where I think, it starts with the building and making it work really, really well for everybody. And then I think the whole idea of the peak demand becomes a much easier proposition. And that just repeating the Passive House were talking about this, and they make the point that unless we do this, the energy system just does not have capacity to basically go to zero carbon. I'm not an expert there, so I'm repeating facts rather than.
I mean, it does feel, just to respond to that briefly, it does feel like we are moving to a situation where the energy system is being viewed in policy and regulation as something to optimize rather than to predict and provide, because there's just not the capacity to predict and provide and endlessly be inefficient. It's still not unchallenging. And if Kate, in some respects, you have focused on let's get the fabric of buildings to be as effective and efficient and therefore not require much energy. Joanna, perhaps you could elaborate a bit more on, you can also still give them energy capability, which adds not just to their equation, as it were, but also to the system's equation.
Yeah, I think because it works the other way as well. Obviously we would have reduced the amount of energy they use in the first place, but then if we're generating energy on them, it's how you control that when you're feeding it back to the grid. So on our buildings, because we've got electrical and thermal storage, they act as buffers so that when we're generating energy, it's not necessarily being fed directly into the grid. It's either being used by the building or stored to be used later in the day or maybe the following morning. And we're also able to do the same with electric vehicles. So we don't have as yet the vehicle to building charging capability, but our buildings are ready to be able to take that when that technology is more widely available. But we can certainly, if we plug in electric vehicles, we can defer when they're charged, depending on carbon intensity of the grid or the cost of electricity. And it works in both directions. So we're able to, like on the university campus, we're on a red, amber, green tariff. So we're able to store our electricity in the day and then feed that into the grid between 5 and 7 when it would otherwise be costing the university quite a lot more per kilowatt hour for their electricity. So we're able to sort of balance that supply and demand of energy. And we've worked with quite a few different companies to trial different ways of doing that. So the building acts as a virtual power plant, and it's basically able to manage that flow of energy either direction. So I think that's the benefit of having the storage, but also the controllability of the energy. So you can choose when it does interact with the grid. And I think that'll become even more important as we go forward.
Thank you. I think, Charlotte, in a sense, that plays into some of the full chain flexibility things you've described. And I'm just thinking, Emily, you'd mentioned if we're going to have 40 gigawatts of offshore, then 30 gigawatts of flexibility. I haven't been able to do a quick calculation on what that might mean for buildings, but you could imagine, and I've seen research, I think, from Imperial that highlights domestic and building-based storage capability, thermal or electrical, could take a lot of that offshore wind at the times when it's generated and then manage that flow, in a sense, part of the flow equation that Joanna's talking about. Perhaps, Charlotte, because you particularly pointed out this sort of planning domain, do you think it's part of Ofgem's job, or maybe I shouldn't put you on the spot about Ofgem's job into the future, but it does feel to be there's something that's both in the regulatory environment to encourage this convening and coordination. How can we, and maybe it's partly a role for BEIS as well as local government, and is it now the Levelling Up and Communities Department? How do we bring that convenedness together to get some good, effective decisions rolled out in places? Any thoughts on that? Perhaps I'll start with you, Charlotte, and then Emily.
I can offer a couple of thoughts. So just sort of thinking back to that original question around sort of overall demand reduction, then coupled with planning and responsibilities of Ofgem in this space. Like in that space in particular, our role is to make sure that those, such as Joanna's been sort of sharing, like your university, like we need to make sure that that kind of behaviour is being fairly rewarded. Like this is absolutely this is flexible behaviour at its best, and we need to make sure that the value that's been invested by the university in this instance, in terms of responsive technologies that allows them to participate, that investment decision, there's a market there that's prompted that investment decision. So need to make sure that their actions are fairly rewarded. But on the flip side of that, and maybe it's for consumers who are becoming off-grid, who are sort of becoming kind of self-sufficient, albeit still connected to the grid, what we need to make sure is that there is also a fair allocation of those kind of national costs, of the costs that we all share, the network costs, the infrastructure costs, that there's a fair allocation of costs across all parties to make sure that the vulnerable, those who can't participate in the way that Joanna's University is participating, to make sure that they're not unfairly disadvantaged. So sort of our role as the regulator is to kind of match up both of those things. You know, the flexibility agenda is about us trying to create markets that allow those who can respond to make the appropriate investments to be able to participate. Our role as regulator is also to protect those who can't be part of those markets, to make sure that they're still they're living in, they can heat their homes, they're living in warm homes, and that energy is affordable for them. And that it then plays into the bigger question about planning overall, because a lot of the focus on flexibility is about allowing markets to disseminate data and information to market participants to do the right thing. But some of the actions that could be taken that are sort of more in the planning domain can really erode that value. So it sort of becomes as much a role for government, but there's real pressure there in the government space in terms of the targets they set on renewables and how they back up those targets with support. It could lead to an erosion of the value that Joanna's University sees in terms of being able to participate, depending on what technologies come forward. So the role for the regulator and for government is making sure that we get that balance right, where we're in the planning phase, which is absolutely necessary, like sending the right signals for investors so that the flexible resources are there as well as the renewable resources. But we need to see that it's a balance to be had. We can't just command and control everything, because that ends up with the much higher price scenario for reaching net zero. And I think that's what the Imperial research showed us. If you're referring from sort of 2017, I think it was, that they demonstrated through their modelling that there's just a really big disparity if you don't enable flexibility in the way that Joanna really described. If you dictate too much of what needs to be there to help us meet net zero, we invariably do it at a much, much higher cost and lose all of this opportunity that is growing really fast in the building space.
Yes, there is definitely a balancing act, isn't there? Emily, if you'd like to pick up on any part of those questions, I'm then going to warm everybody else up for the last few minutes, where I'll ask each panelist for one final comment while we look at the final graphic for going on with. And yes, to those people who have asked, we'll definitely be sharing it. We'll put it back up after Emily has answered this question. And then I will ask Emily, Charlotte, Kate and Joanna in that order for their last comment before we close at 1 o'clock. Emily, over to you.
Thank you, Hywel. So right at the beginning of this section, you referenced the increase in electricity demands and the role that flexibility could play in helping to manage that. And I think that's absolutely crucial. The estimates that we've put out is around £10 billion a year savings by 2050 if we have a smart and flexible system compared with the alternative. And that really is saving from not having to build generation, which is there to balance out the system when needed. At the moment, that generation is largely fossil, coal and gas. So there's an awful lot of gain to be had here if we get this right, and that's why there's so much focus on developing this market. And the other comment I'd make on that is thinking about the role of businesses, the role of buildings in this, is that looking at our modelling, there's a similar role to be played by short-term storage options and by demand-side response. And so, as Charlotte's been saying, what we really want to do is to create the environment where these different solutions can come forward and we get the best mix that we need of the different options in order to get us to net zero in as least cost away as possible.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Emma, who's running this fine broadcast for us, to put up the image. While you have a moment to think, Emily, I'll come to you for your last observation, then Charlotte, Kate and Joanna. It feels to me like there's a lot of rich opportunity here. A lot of work is being done by a variety of people and actors, whether they be government, private sector, innovation organisations like the one I work with at the Active Building Centre. There are also still a lot of unanswered questions, some of which have been raised in the questions, and apologies if we didn't get to your question. We will try and pick that up post-event as part of a response, where we will also share this lovely graphic, and we'll probably fine-tune it a little bit more. I think the one thing that just towards the end you're reminding me of, it's not just a question of creating a nice, interesting system because we've got all these tools and technologies. It's a purposeful system. It's a less expensive system for the UK. It ought to be much lower carbon, if not no carbon. It will be much less pollution locally and nationally because of the nature of the energy that's coming to it being renewable. There's all sorts of benefits in those domains. There may also be benefits for the fuel poor as we change the nature of their interaction with the system. And certainly in Wales, where I've been working on the Welsh Fuel Poverty Panel, there's a question to be asked about, if the storage isn't going to be for everyone, perhaps we could target its deployment to people who are currently fuel poor, and that might change their energy equation and their energy economics. So a lot to be played for, a lot of people putting a lot of intellect and talent behind it. So thank you for our panelists bringing theirs to this session today. Emily, your last thought you'd like to leave either the panelists or the viewers with?
Thank you, Hywel, and thank you very much for inviting me along today. I thought it was a really interesting session. I think my observation from the really helpful questions we've had is just quite how broad and integrated a picture we've got here and how many different people need to be involved and brought in. And from Caroline's wonderful picture, the reminder that enabling and empower the consumer has got to be front and centre in our thinking on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for joining us. Charlotte.
Thanks, Hywel. I've been reflecting over a sort of significant time frame over the reforms that have shaped the energy markets, let's say over the last 20 odd years. The ability of demand, of consumers, of buildings to contribute to create that secure, affordable and net zero system. The ability of demand to deliver that has been at the heart of the market reforms that we've seen over the last 2 decades. It really feels like the value that's on the table this time around means that this time around, the reforms that will come really need to deliver on what has been at the heart of many reforms in the past, much of the reform in the past, because there's so much value on the table, not just the financial value, but also in terms of really realising net zero for the UK and putting the UK to be in a position of being a world leader for how to take these kind of technologies forward, how to take new business approaches forward, and how to build an enabled and empowered consumer base that is really able to embrace all of this and deliver net zero. So this time really needs to be the time that the regulatory and policy reform actually do embrace the value that consumers and buildings in demand can bring.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for joining us. Sounds like a fantastic call for the prosumer of the future. Kate.
Thank you. And thanks again for inviting me to take part. I'm just looking at the picture in front of us, and I think what is coming out to me, without repeating all the things that I've said already, is that it's really exciting, and I think that should be what we're embracing. that for all the designers, for communities, there's a massive opportunity to do something really exciting and different here. And I think at the heart of it, people, but also the idea of sharing and making resource more fairly distributed, suddenly seems possible with all of this. So the technology we sort of have already, we just need to work out what we want to do with it and how to make it a really much better way of using our energy in the country.
Thank you very much, Kate, for joining us and for those last thoughts. Joanna.
Thank you. I'll be quick. Yeah, I think we've heard today how important smart, flexible buildings are as we move forward to a low carbon society. And I think it's been a really interesting discussion with all the other speakers. And yeah, I agree. It's an exciting time to accelerate the adoption of some of these solutions for building projects now, and how we can all work together as we all need to. Consumers, building developers and designers, and also the energy companies and government. We all need to just work together. We've got the solutions here, but it's how we accelerate those now going forward, I think, is really critical and an exciting opportunity for us all.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you to all the panelists, and particularly thank you to Caroline Chappell, who's created that fantastic image from our discussion today, but also obviously our pre-work to make sure we were ready to give our attendees as interesting a session as we could manage today. So thank you and goodbye from COP. Clearly many days of work here, people collaborating to make that difference to what can be achieved on climate change and get us all to net zero. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.